Welcome to another podcast for Homefield Group's Real Talk. Today I am with my partner Jeff Bauer, and we are very excited to welcome the Manager of Planning for Huron County, Denise Van Amersfoort. And today we want to get talking to Denise. Of course, as everybody is well aware, we have major supply problems in Huron County and beyond. And so we want to talk about Huron County specifically today and get Denise's perspective as a planner as to how we are going to solve the problem of supply that we are currently enduring in this area. So I guess we'll get things started off, and just to ask Denise, I mean, thanks for coming on, and sort of, you're from the area, you grew up in this area, and why don't you just tell us a little bit about what got you here and today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rick. Thanks for having me. Yes, I grew up on a small farm outside Seaforth. I went to Seaforth District High School before it closed, transitioned over to Central Huron, did my Master's of Rural Planning and Development at the University of Guelph, and I've been here planning in the community for about 15 years. So it's been really a great and fulfilling opportunity to go away to school and to come home and practice in the community that you care so much about.
Absolutely.
So it's been great.
Good. So let's get into it, into the thick of the planning talk. Like, I mean, right now, as I mentioned previously, we have a supply problem in Huron County in general. And that supply problem is creating massive price impact in that it's driving prices up high. And the only way that we can really bring pricing down in our communities is through supply. Right. And we do have a bunch of supply on the pipeline, or in the pipeline on its way to the market. So let's start with, we already have a subdivision in Goddard that we're well aware of. There's a subdivision on its heels that's checkerboarded with the Wood subdivision that we're involved with, Coast Goddard. And then there's a couple of subdivisions planned for up in the Saltford Heights area. Those will be how far down the pipeline do you figure those projects are?
So the one project in Salford is out for public consultation right now, and it's within the review process. There are a number of plans of subdivision that are in various stages of the either approvals or into the registration process across the county. I can certainly say that there's likely more plans of subdivision underway at this time than we've maybe ever had before in our history. So it is exciting. There are things happening. There's also plans of subdivision that are being registered and are nearly being built out. I can think of a couple in Seaforth. There was a public meeting for a new plan of sub just last week, again for Seaforth. We have a couple in Clinton that are going through, that are either into construction or are in the final kind of registration process. Where else? We have Exeter has development. There's some exciting things happening in Wingham in terms of Hutton Heights. The North Huron Council has been leading some development there. So there are pieces moving, certainly, to try to bring more supply online in terms of development applications on those bigger applications.
And those ones that we're making reference to just now are on the sort of fringe sort of exteriors of municipalities, right? Pretty much?
Of urban areas. So I would say that they're what we call greenfield development, okay. Right? So they're the ones that are on the edges of town, and they're being built out and then connected back in. What we're also really wanting to shift our focus to is intensification.
In town.
That's right? So building up even further. Because the fact is, communities have already made investments in infrastructure, in all the pipes in the ground. We've made investments into parks and recreational spaces. And we know that from a climate perspective, when we can walk, when we can make use of those existing infrastructure, that's development that's not only walkable and good for us in terms of our public health and social abilities to interact with others, but it's also good from a climate perspective. And finally, it's farmland protection at its best. We need to be finding ways that our communities can grow up and not out.
And on that note, so I have, in my years of selling real estate, I have always told buyers that it was my understanding that Huron County Planning, one of their mandates is to protect the farmland because Huron County is such an agriculturally based, or let's say agriculturally rich zone, that planning has a vested interest in making sure that the residential development takes place within the towns and villages and doesn't infringe on the farmland.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why, for example, you can't own a farm and then on the land that fronts a county road, chop down, like 2-acre parcels off and sell them to residential developers for building houses.
Yeah, and I would say that's in everybody's interest, right? We need to maintain our ability to have farmlands kept for farming, right? That's where we need the ability to produce food and to maintain the ability for those activities to happen. So you're right, where residential can occur within those existing urban boundaries, that's where it should be. And again, it's from a fiscal perspective. We want to think about the fact that, we've already made an infrastructure investment, so how can we make best use of them? So there's a range of pieces that you sort of touched on in the opening, and I think that sort of where we've been looking at things, certainly from a planning standpoint, is how can we open up more doors? How can we create more options as of right to help people become stably housed? Because as we know, and you know better than I do, in February of 2022, the average sale price in Huron and Perth was over $754,000, right? When we think about that as a sale price, right? How many members of our community are being left behind without options for housing?
I was talking to a mortgage broker before we got in here today, and the said mortgage broker said they have, they're working with clients who are first-time home buyers, makes $80,000 a year, has no debt, has 10% to put down on a property, and she said, hey, you know what, you can comfortably afford, a mortgage in the $400,000 range. And the guy's saying, well, what am I going to do with that? Like, I can't, with $400,000, I can't buy a house.
That's a mobile home or a modular on a leased lot now. Yeah. That's where that gets you in the market.
Which touches on the different types of property ownership, or let's say ownership in general. So is it in the plans that you've seen, and let's say plans of subdivision that you've seen and talking to developers, are we going to see an occurrence of some different styles of ownership models coming in? Like, I know we have condominiums are starting to take off in this area. We have properties on leased land in this area. Are we going to see more of that kind of development happening?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about there is the tenure, right? So is it freehold? Is it condo? Is it a rental opportunity? Sometimes, we'll see a development which is purchased maybe by people who are purchasing that as an investment property, but they turn around and rent it to somebody in the community. So it's still bringing a unit online. And I think what we want to talk about a little bit is it's about opening up all of the options that we can identify. So it's not just, is it ownership or is it rental, but it's also, well, what's the type of building? We have, as we know, right, as you drive through Clinton and Goderich and Seaforth and Wingham, we have a lot of single detached houses.
Yes. Right?
That's predominantly what we have. But if you look at the developments in the last couple of years in any one of those communities and you drive through the new developments, you'll notice a lot more row housing, right? Semi-detached. And those are what we call sort of the missing middle. And it's about having that gentle intensification of our communities in a way that we're delivering more units to the market on the same piece of land. Right? So what might have been, 2 larger homes is now 4 more compact homes, which are more affordable, but also they cater to a different range of needs. And it might not just be financial needs, right? We think about somebody who wants to downsize for a social or a physical need. That single floor plan all of a sudden allows someone to live independently, with dignity for a longer period of time, especially if we think about aging in place.
Yeah, on that note, you have seen this incredible increase in the number of fourplexes that are going up, or these bungalow style row houses. I mean, they've been popping up everywhere in towns all around here. And typically, the buyers for those properties are retirees. They're people who are downsizing out of a single detached home and wanting main floor living. The interesting thing that I hope we start to see in the coming years would be that type of ownership where you're getting, let's say, more doors per square foot of ground, but they're not necessarily just geared toward people who are retiring. We need to see doors open that are geared toward people who are young professionals. In other words, a starter market. A starter market so that somebody can buy something to get their start in home ownership, pay that down for a few years, maybe it grows a little in value, and then they can graduate to a single detached, and they have this ownership model to transition from renting to finally getting into a single detached.
Right. And I think we've actually already seen that shift. You know, I think it was predominantly seniors, but I do think we've already seen some, you know, those 2-story row houses, right? And those really do work well for maybe a young family. Yeah. And so I think we're starting to see that. And again, it goes back to that price tag, and that's what, you know, folks can afford for as a starter type home.
So the way to keep the price point down is to try and intensify the number of units on the said lot.
That's right. And so from a planning standpoint, what we want to do is we want to make more options permitted as of right. And so what I mean by as of right is, you know, sort of planning speak, but what it means is that somebody can come in and let's say they have a property and it's got a single detached. I'm actually going to use an example. I just did an application in Clinton, and you know, the house had fallen into disrepair over the years. Actually, nobody had been living in it for the last number of years, and so it was purchased, and the person wanted to take down the single and put up a semi-detached, so put up 2 units. Well, that required what's called a zoning bylaw amendment, and so they had to come through a planning approvals process, which involves timelines, public meetings. You know, the planning department has to do reviews, there's fees involved, and at the end of the day, you know, there really wasn't any concern from the neighborhood, and it was approved, and then they'll be able to go on and get their building permit for that semi-detached unit. What we mean by as of right is we'd actually change the zoning bylaws such that that semi-detached is permitted, and that they can bypass the planning approvals and just go straight to the building department. Because what that does is it delivers the units in a more efficient timeline. And, you know, that's what the market really needs right now. We need more units being delivered to the market in an efficient and predictable timeline.
And not getting roadblocks with red tape.
And that part of the process can be intimidating to a potential, like if there's, I know we've got places that have specific zoning that we put on the market, and you field phone calls from people, and you mention, okay, there will be a process to a bylaw amendment for this, and it can be very, to somebody who's never done it, that could be a very, very intimidating process, right? So that it's not just the cost, but the timeline and the, you know, experience that someone might need for something like that definitely plays in terms of the consumer. Right.
Yeah, I think that's fair comment. So we want to try to, as you say, streamline the approvals and really take a critical look at the way that planning is set up to deliver units to the market, and how do, because we interact with that process, right? The zoning bylaws have, you know, quite a bit of influence over what can be built where. Yep. And so what Huron County Council directed us to do, actually it was sort of late 2019, was to do, to really look at how planning was interacting with the housing markets, and essentially what levers could we identify to open those doors. And so there's a series of initiatives undertaken. The Housing Friendly Review is sort of the chief document in terms of overviewing or overhauling some of the official plan and zoning bylaw policies to allow for that intensification to happen as of right. At the same time, we want density to be done well. And in sitting around the council table, you know, as I have for about 15 years, you know, we've identified these trends when it comes to neighborhood concerns. You know, they tend to be fairly common concerns, right? Whether it's about traffic impacts, parking, the height of a building, you know, those are the types of things that we commonly hear about. So we thought, okay, how can we comprehensively address these concerns in a way that can build some confidence within the community that, you know, we can do density and we can do it really well. So we developed a document with the urban design team from MHBC Planning and local architect Jason Morgan of Alan Avis Architect to develop what's called the RIGS, the Residential Intensification Guideline. And it outlines basically how can density be done well, and how can it be kind of exciting to see these new forms of housing coming into our neighborhoods, but they're being done in a really thoughtful way that addresses what might be community concern.
Oh, that's interesting. And obviously they will look like they'll have aesthetic appeal. They'll be unique. And I mean, I'm asking you this, are they going to look different than what we see? Are we talking 6-story buildings? Are we talking like when you're talking about that RIGS document, what specifically is it going to, or how is it going to shape what our skyline looks like?
Right, so it applies to buildings with more than 4 units. And basically it looks at, well, what's the context of the lot which you're developing? So it gets really down to that lot specific. So let's say, for example, you're on a corner lot. We want to make sure that if you're going to do a corner lot development, that you've been thinking about both sides of the building, right? That you don't leave one essentially blank, save and except for one little window, right? We want to see a bit of a corner treatment. We want to see that parking tucked in behind. But after that, I mean, we don't want to see housing be put into sort of a really strict design controls.
Okay.
I mean, the thing that makes our community so interesting is that when you walk through, the neighborhoods of Goderich, there's individuality in the design of the buildings, and it creates interest, right? We don't want to say, well, we want it to look like this cookie cutter community. It's like, no, we want to allow people to have some individuality of design, but within the parameters that are set out by the RIGS.
Right, okay. So the RIGS doesn't necessarily have constraints on design. It has, like, on specific elements of design.
It's best practices.
Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of the higher density and like high-rise type buildings, I know that there's community, not concerned, but people know that that's something that's being proposed in the various communities and would solve a lot of the problems, just because you fit so many people.
Doors per square foot lot.
Yeah, that
Right.
you mentioned. So what's the outlook in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years of those sorts of projects? Huron County wide, we don't have to talk specifics or anything, obviously, but those sorts of projects, there's grumblings of. What's the planning department's feelings on those, and how do those move forward?
Yeah. I think that, as a community, we do need to get more comfortable with density. I think that it's just not been something that we've traditionally seen in terms of, new 4, 6-story buildings, even going beyond that into higher stories. It's just not something that our communities have been used to, quite frankly. And it's change, right? And no matter what change is, right? Change can be hard because there's some concern built in there. So I think that what from a planning perspective is that we want to look at, well, how can we address some of the concern that the community has about those? And at the same time, we'll be doing a very thoughtful review about where are those 6 or higher stories appropriate in our communities and under what parameters. So I think that that's something that we'll continue to see more of, if I'm honest. Like, I do think that, even here in Goderich, there's been obviously the proposal for downtown, which is a 6-story building. That was conceived of back in 2008 when they did the Goderich official plan. It didn't actually come to a design and come to the community as an application until I think it was about 2019. But we were already projecting that far out. We will see this in downtown Goderich. We will see this in other parts of Goderich. And so I think it's important for the community to know we want to have these conversations. We want to unpack, what are the advantages to these developments? What concerns us about these developments? That's really the role of planning, is to try to act a bit as the interpreter between the development community and the members of the public, and making recommendations ultimately to our decision makers about how can we prepare, or how can we facilitate development that's going to meet the needs of the community, right? That's sort of the role of the planner.
Does planning take, obviously it does take into consideration, and this is my own ignorance, but let's say there's 5 new 5-story buildings in town, plus the new developments, and you've got thousands of additional citizens. So how, like, it's already impossible to get a plumber to come to your house to fix your sink.
Right.
How, like, that's the free market, I understand, you know, like, you can't force plumbers to become plumbers in Goderich, but like, how does a planner take that into consideration, the services and the trades and the different things that are required for when you add like a massive amount of people?
Can I comment on that? Yeah. I'm going to say, I'm assuming that what planning would be expecting is that if you have a vacuum where there's need, then the market will fill it eventually. So for example, with the plumbing example, you know, if it's brutally hard to get a plumber to come over and fix your faucet, then eventually
the price of getting a plumber goes so high that people will become plumbers.
That's right. Yeah.
It's kind of what happened to houses.
Exactly.
But at the same time, there are other services that are delivered by municipalities. And so we need to think about how do those, so I think about recreation services, right? For example, or library services. You know, if the population of Goderich was to, you know, grow, and even I'll use the surrounding area. And this is actually, you know, it's a discussion that we're having with communities through various planning projects right now. You know, if, for example, let's use libraries. So if the surrounding area around Goderich is going to continue to grow to a certain point, you know, can the Goderich Library in its physical state today continue to meet the service expectations? Or might it need to have expansion? That is where development charges can help to capture the cost of growth, so that, you know, growth doesn't entirely pay for itself when we're talking about residential, but we want it to pay for at least a good portion of itself, as opposed to put that on the levy or on the tax base. And there's so development charges, for example, the town of Goderich would have a development charges bylaw, and that looks at, you know, how does new development pay into the wastewater treatment plant,
right,
the water systems, recreation in the town, upgrades to, you know, sidewalks or whatever it ends up being, right? So there are services that are impacted, as you say, when growth continues.
So I guess the motivating factor behind having development charges imposed by the municipality is really to address the impact that the added population is going to have to the services?
Yes.
Because you don't realize the tax benefit until further down the road.
Right.
Once people are in there paying taxes, but the roads and the infrastructure and the recreation needs are there. Another funny thing with Goderich, because it's the biggest center in the area and has those services, they're used by the communities that are surrounding
the periphery. Yeah.
So you've got a library that is in Goderich, but it's serving, you know, a massive amount. Library is maybe not a great example, but
it's a county service.
It's a county service.
Yeah, it's a county
exactly.
service.
But, you know, something that the town owns, the medical center,
yeah,
the recreation center, these
for
things
sure,
that are providing those services for, you know, you look at how many people are out at the Bluffs, for instance, and everything that they need is in Goderich. So it's a fine balance.
That was leading me to my next question, which is
perfect.
Nailed it. Yeah, thank you for teeing that up for me. The population numbers projected in 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Like if we look at someplace like the Bluffs, and I don't know if you've ever been down there, it is amazing to see how many people are going to be living there within a matter of about 5 years. Do you know those kind of numbers? And does planning know, like, by 2035, Goderich is probably going to be at a population number of 9,000, 10,000 people? Like,
yeah. So population projections in a slow growth area, it's an interesting exercise. And if you look at, for example, what Ministry of Finance was projecting for Huron County back in 2016, the last census period, we were projected to go through a relative stability, a slight increase, and then over time, by 2046, they had us in a decline.
Oh, really?
Projection. 5 years later, in 2021, right, the census has actually not entirely been released yet. It's sort of been, they released the information in segments. We're now seeing remarkably different numbers for Perth, or Huron County and Huron Perth generally. And so, you know, I think that's part of this issue, is that when you've relied on population projections, they're not always accurate, right? And so I think we have to think about what are the what are the assumptions going into the way that those projections are done. We also work closely with our partners at Avon-Maitland District School Board and Huron Perth, looking at school board projections. So this work is all done in tangent, and I think it's likely the county will look to do some enhanced population and household projections once the full 2021 census is released, because you're right, we need to have a target. How many houses do we need for this area, within a margin? We know right now, we absolutely need to deliver more supply, but I think it is definitely useful to have at least that target zone of, okay, this is where we need to be, because it informs things like minimum density requirements. Right? If you are going to do a development, you need to produce a minimum number of units per hectare.
And here's another question on that, the heels of that. So is there a target number? You say there's a target number that we want to maybe achieve, but is there a number where you maybe want to say, okay, this is our capacity, this is where we max out because of the protection of the farmland surrounding, right? There's going to be a capacity restriction if we want to protect the farmland that's surrounding us.
Not entirely. I mean, we want to look at basically thinking about our borders as much as possible as staying where they are. Right? We have enough growth area, certainly right now, within our existing borders to accommodate for growth. And beyond that, we really want to think about, how can we utilize existing properties within our own community? That example I gave, where the single goes down and the 2-unit goes up. Well, there's other examples. I mean, if you look at the former McGee lot, that wasn't even residential before. Now, it could be home to a great number of individuals.
Yeah, the Jeffries property over where...
the lumberyard.
Yeah, the lumberyard.
Absolutely. And so there's other properties, and I think it's also questioning us to take a really critical look at underutilized properties in our community, properties that might be owned even by the provincial government that really are surplus to their needs, and we could put them to better use in the local context for housing, and maybe specifically for affordable housing.
Right.
So moving a little bit away from that market end of the spectrum and thinking about the other end of the spectrum, which is affordable housing, and looking at it as really critical community infrastructure. We need to provide subsidized housing opportunities for our community in order for it to be a healthy, prosperous community.
Right.
It's a basic need, right? It's not something that, it's not a frill benefit.
No, it's not.
So there is excess property around. I know Goddard specifically, there's a number of underutilized areas that the town is making some opinions on. I know at the CEDC we've chatted a number of times about these underutilized spaces, because in terms of economic development of an area, there's such a lack of affordable housing for people to move into to fill jobs for the employers, and it's just a vicious cycle that continues to just, like, you can't have more people unless there's more services, and you can't get people. It's a catch-22, right? So it's not a good state of affairs. So.
Well, Denise, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. I could talk about this for hours.
We could go into countless different things that we could chat about, and maybe we'll just have to have you back another time.
Yeah. It would actually be good to have you back, because then we can see sort of how things, as they evolve, we can get your context on the evolution of the development that's happened in the area. So we appreciate you coming in. We thank you, if you're still watching, we thank you for sticking around for another edition of Real Talk.